The first time Evelyn Mercer told me I was going to hand over my lake cabin, she wasn't angry. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't even pretending to negotiate. She stood at my front gate in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my pickup truck, smiled like she was announcing the weather, and said, "You'll be signing the transfer documents next week. My son needs somewhere peaceful to recover." I remember looking at her for a second, then looking past her at the lake, then back at her again. "No," I said. "Just one word. Simple. Honest." The funny thing is, some people hear no as the end of a conversation. People like Evelyn hear it as the beginning of a war. At the time, I was 48 years old, living alone at a cabin on Silver Pine Lake, a place my father built with his own hands back in 1976. Every crooked floorboard had a story. Every nail in those walls had probably passed through his fingers. My dad wasn't a rich man. He was a survey engineer who believed that if something mattered, you measured it carefully and protected it forever. When he passed away, the cabin became mine. I never planned to sell it. Never even considered it. Some people inherit money. I inherited a place that still smelled like old cedar after a summer rain, and honestly, that felt more valuable. The morning Evelyn showed up, I had been replacing a damaged step on the dock. It was peaceful. The water was flat as glass. A pair of ducks drifted across the shoreline. Then I heard heels crunching across gravel, and New Peace had officially clocked out for the day. Her son, Connor, stood a few feet behind her. He was in his early 30s, athletic, expensive sunglasses, expensive watch, expensive attitude. The kind of guy who looked around other people's property the way most people browse a real estate website. He wasn't looking at my cabin like a guest. He was studying it like an acquisition. Evelyn launched into a speech full of words that sounded impressive until you actually listened to them. Community redevelopment, resource optimization, shared asset allocation, recovery-oriented living environment. It was corporate nonsense wrapped in HOA language. Finally, I interrupted her. "Which section of the HOA rules says you can take somebody else's property?" She blinked. Not because she didn't hear me, because nobody usually challenged her. "The board has already reviewed the proposal," she said. "That's not what I asked." She crossed her arms. Connor rolled his eyes. I walked inside, grabbed my property deed, my HOA documents, and an old survey map my father kept framed near the front door. When I came back outside, I laid everything across the porch railing. "Show me where your authority comes from." Evelyn didn't even glance at the papers. That was the moment I realized this was never about rules. Rules were just tools she used when they were convenient. What she really believed was that power created ownership. If she wanted something badly enough, eventually she'd get it. Before leaving, she smiled again. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile somebody gives right before they decide you're a problem. "You'll reconsider," she said. "No," I answered. "What I'll do is document this conversation." For the first time, her expression shifted. Just slightly. Then she turned and walked back toward her SUV. Connor followed. Halfway down the driveway, she was already talking on her phone. I watched them disappear around the curve of the road and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear. Not exactly. More like the feeling you get when dark clouds appear on the horizon while you're still standing in sunlight. That afternoon, I pulled out a notebook and wrote one name across the first page. Evelyn Mercer. Looking back now, that notebook might have been the most important decision I made. The next morning, I called a surveying company I'd trusted for years. Most people don't spend their weekends studying property records, but I used to work construction management, and old habits die hard. While reviewing county parcel maps online that night, I stumbled across something strange. There was a narrow strip of land running along the north side of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association office. Everyone assumed the HOA owned it. I assumed the HOA owned it. According to county records, they didn't. I zoomed in, checked again, then checked a third time because I thought there had to be a mistake. The parcel belonged to my father, which meant it now belonged to me. I sat there staring at the screen for nearly 10 minutes. 30 feet wide, long enough to wrap around part of the HOA headquarters property. I wrote down the parcel number and circled it twice. At the time, I didn't know exactly why it mattered. I only knew it felt important. 3 days later, survey crews placed fresh boundary markers around my cabin property. For days after that, retaliation arrived. A violation notice appeared under my front door before sunrise. According to the document, My survey markers qualified as unauthorized construction under Article 12B of the HOA guidelines. I had 72 hours to remove them or face daily fines. There was only one problem. Article 12B didn't exist. I spent less than 15 minutes proving it. The real HOA documents contained no such section. No amendment. No authority. Nothing. By lunchtime, I had written confirmation from the county clerk. By dinner, I had mailed a certified response exposing every false claim in Evelyn's notice. The following evening, she took things public. A post appeared in the neighborhood social group complaining about a disruptive homeowner creating division and hostility within the community. She never used my name. She didn't have to. She included a picture of my survey stakes. Everybody knew who she meant. I took screenshots and said nothing. Sometimes silence gathers more information than an argument. 2 days later, an elderly woman named Margaret Holloway called and asked if she could speak with me privately. That phone call would change everything, because before it ended, I would discover Evelyn wasn't trying to steal one cabin. She had been quietly taking pieces of the entire neighborhood for years. Margaret lived 3 streets over from the HOA office, in a small blue house with wind chimes hanging from the porch and flower beds that looked like she'd spent 20 years caring for them one plant at a time. When I arrived, she seemed nervous, the way people look when they've spent too long wondering whether they're imagining a problem or finally seeing it clearly. She sat me down at her kitchen table, poured 2 cups of coffee, then slid a thick folder across the wood. "I think they took part of my yard," she said quietly. At first I assumed it was some simple property dispute. Then I started reading. 14 months earlier she'd signed paperwork she believed authorized landscaping improvements near her fence line. A few months later she received maintenance bills for land she supposedly no longer owned. Buried inside the paperwork was a transfer agreement moving nearly 4,000 square feet of her property into a maintenance trust. She had signed it without realizing what it actually did. The more I read, the worse it got. I copied every date, every signature, every notary stamp. Then I went home and spent the next 3 evenings reviewing property records for every home around Silver Pine Lake. There were 49 homes in the association. By the end of the second night, a pattern emerged so clearly it made my stomach turn. 12 homeowners had signed what appeared to be voluntary easement agreements, boundary modifications, or maintenance transfers during the previous 5 years. 8 of those transfers eventually ended up under the control of the same development company, Lakeshore Horizon Partners. Registered manager, Connor Mercer. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen. Suddenly everything made sense. Evelyn didn't want my cabin because her son needed peace and recovery. She wanted my land because it connected several pieces of shoreline they already controlled. Without my property, their planned lakefront development couldn't be completed. My cabin wasn't desirable. It was necessary. Once I understood that, her behavior stopped being confusing and started becoming predictable. The pressure intensified almost immediately. Another neighborhood post appeared online accusing me directly of harassing community leadership. Then somebody mentioned the exact afternoon I had visited Margaret's house. That detail bothered me more than anything else. It meant somebody was watching. Maybe several people. Instead of responding publicly, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. His name was Daniel Price, an investigative reporter I'd met during a zoning dispute long ago. "Tell me something interesting," he said after answering the phone. "How interested are you in an HOA that might be operating a real estate acquisition scheme?" I asked. There was a pause. "How much evidence do you have?" "Enough to keep you busy." Around the same time, I hired an attorney named Rebecca Sloan. She specialized in community association law, and, unlike most lawyers, she spoke plainly enough that normal people could actually understand her. After reviewing everything I'd collected, she pushed the documents aside and looked at me across her desk. "They're creating paperwork that appears legitimate long enough to pressure homeowners into compliance," she said. "It's sophisticated because most people never question it." A week later, Evelyn announced an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda was written in dense legal language, but the goal was obvious. They wanted an official record declaring me non-compliant, disruptive, and harmful to the community. Rebecca advised me to attend, say almost nothing, and sign absolutely nothing. The meeting took place inside the community center. 14 households attended. Out of 49, I immediately noticed the problem. According to the bylaws, 30% participation was required for binding votes. They weren't even close. Evelyn stood at the front of the room, delivering a speech about community harmony, while Connor sat beside her pretending to take notes. Every time someone asked a difficult question, she redirected the conversation. Every time somebody requested documentation, she delayed the answer. Then she called for a vote condemning my actions and authorizing further enforcement measures. 11 hands went up. 2 abstained. 1 voted no. Evelyn smiled and announced the motion had passed. I wrote down every procedural violation without saying a word. No quorum verification. Ineligible members voting. Missing records. Ignored questions. The next morning, Rebecca confirmed exactly what I already suspected. The vote was legally worthless. More importantly, it demonstrated a pattern of intentional manipulation. That same week, things escalated from dishonest to criminal. At 2:11 in the morning, motion alerts from one of my trail cameras woke me up. I checked the footage and watched a figure dressed in dark clothing carefully move 4 of my survey stakes. Not remove them, move them. Just enough to create confusion about the property boundary. Whoever did it understood exactly what they were doing. I saved multiple copies of the footage and restored everything before sunrise. Then, just when I thought the situation couldn't become more disturbing, I came home one afternoon and found my front door slightly open. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing seemed stolen. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew somebody had been there. It felt wrong, like walking into a room and sensing a conversation had ended seconds before you arrived. Then I noticed a cedar keepsake box sitting open beneath a bookshelf. The box had belonged to my late wife, Anna. Inside were little things that meant almost nothing to strangers and everything to me. A pressed flower from our anniversary trip, a handwritten note, an old silver coin she carried for luck. Someone had taken those items out and arranged them on the floor in a careful semicircle. My chest tightened immediately. It wasn't theft. It was a message. Then I saw the document on my kitchen table. A property transfer agreement. Fully prepared. Professionally printed. Already signed by Evelyn Mercer. My information had been left blank. Waiting. I sat there staring at it for several minutes, trying to process the sheer arrogance of what I was looking at. Then I picked up my phone. First call, Sheriff's Department. Second call, Rebecca. Third call, Daniel. I think we've moved past HOA drama, I told him. How far past, he asked. Far enough that somebody entered my house and left a contract on my kitchen table. There was silence. Then Daniel said something I still remember. Don't touch anything else. I'm coming. 3 days later, another crack appeared in Evelyn's operation. A man named Peter Walsh contacted me through an anonymous email account and asked to meet outside the neighborhood. Peter was the HOA secretary until 6 months earlier. We met at a roadside diner almost 15 miles away. He arrived carrying a padded envelope and looked over his shoulder twice before sitting down. I should have spoken up sooner, he said. Inside the envelope were photocopies of meeting notes that had never appeared in official HOA records. Sessions held after adjournment. Private discussions involving only a handful of people. Property acquisition strategies. Homeowner profiles. Development projections. My name appeared repeatedly. One note dated 8 months earlier read, Waterfront parcel remains critical. Continue pressure campaign after Holloway transfer completed. I wasn't a target because I had resisted. I had been targeted long before I ever knew the game existed. Rebecca reviewed everything that evening and leaned back in her chair. This changes the entire case, she said. Fraud, conspiracy, fiduciary violations, potential criminal referrals. Then she asked when I wanted to move forward. I looked at the parcel map hanging above my desk and thought about the forgotten strip of land beside the HOA headquarters. The one everyone assumed belonged to them. The one that legally belonged to me. For the first time since all this started, I smiled. Give me 1 more week, I said, because by then I finally knew exactly how I wanted this story to end. The following Monday morning arrived cold, quiet, and perfectly clear. The kind of morning where the lake looks like polished glass and the world feels completely ordinary, which made what happened next even better. At 6:15 a.m., the first fence post went into the ground. I had hired a contractor I'd known for years, secured every permit required by the county, verified every measurement twice, and provided copies of the original survey records dating back to my father's ownership. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Everything was exactly where it belonged. By 8 a.m., Nearly a third of the steel fence line was standing. 6-foot black steel panels stretched along the forgotten parcel beside the HOA headquarters, following boundaries that had existed for decades but that almost nobody remembered. At 8:12, a silver SUV came flying into the parking lot. Evelyn practically jumped out before the vehicle stopped moving. She marched toward the construction crew with the confidence of someone who had spent years believing rules applied only to other people. "Stop this immediately," she shouted. The foreman calmly handed her a copy of the permit. I watched her scan the page, then scan it again, then look at the property records attached behind it. For a moment, she seemed genuinely unable to process what she was seeing. "This can't be correct," she said. "Actually," I replied from behind her, "it's exactly correct." She spun around. The expression on her face was worth every second of the previous 6 months. Connor arrived a few minutes later and looked even worse. Both of them immediately started making phone calls. Sheriff's deputies arrived around 9 o'clock. They reviewed the permits, checked county records, confirmed ownership, and reached the same conclusion every other professional had reached. The construction was legal. The property belonged to me. The fence stayed. By then, neighbors had begun gathering around the site. Margaret was there. Peter was there. Several homeowners who had quietly shared concerns over the previous months showed up too. Then Daniel arrived carrying a camera crew. A few minutes later, Rebecca arrived. Shortly after that, representatives from the county prosecutor's office appeared in an unmarked vehicle. That's when things became very uncomfortable for Evelyn Mercer. At 9:47 a.m., I walked across the parking lot carrying 3 thick document binders. One went to the lead investigator. One went to Daniel. One went to the prosecutor's office. Inside were over 100 pages of evidence. Survey records, property transfer histories, internal meeting notes, financial records, fraudulent notices, security footage, witness statements, the transfer agreement left on my kitchen table. Everything organized, everything indexed, everything impossible to explain away. What made the fence so powerful wasn't that it blocked anything important. It was what it revealed. For years, people had assumed the HOA owned that land because nobody bothered checking. The moment the fence appeared, reality became visible. The office hadn't moved. The parking lot hadn't moved. The road hadn't moved. Only the illusion had disappeared. And illusions don't survive long once people can see the truth standing in steel and concrete. Investigations moved surprisingly fast after that. Rebecca filed formal complaints. Sheriff's investigators expanded their inquiries. Financial auditors started reviewing records connected to Lakeshore Horizon Partners. Several bank accounts were frozen pending review. Development funding was suspended. Local officials who had quietly supported projects connected to Connor suddenly became much harder to find. Funny how that happens. About 4 weeks later, formal charges were announced. Evelyn faced allegations involving fraud, fiduciary misconduct, conspiracy, and multiple violations connected to property transfers. Connor wasn't charged immediately, but his company became the subject of a much broader investigation. Court proceedings eventually reversed several disputed property transfers, including Margaret's. I'll never forget the day she called me. She didn't give a speech. She didn't celebrate. She simply said, "I got my backyard back." Then she started crying. Honestly, that meant more to me than any legal victory. A court ordered new HOA elections shortly afterward. Voter turnout was the highest in association history. People who hadn't attended meetings in years suddenly cared very deeply about governance. Imagine that. Margaret won a seat on the new board. Peter declined any leadership role. He said he'd had enough HOA politics for one lifetime. Nobody blamed him. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. The survey stakes remained untouched. The dock stood exactly where it always had. The cabin stayed quiet. One evening late in the fall, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched sunlight slide across Silver Pine Lake. The water glowed gold the way my father used to describe when I was a kid. For the first time in months, there were no lawyers calling, no investigators, no emergency meetings, no accusations online, just silence, real silence, the kind you don't appreciate until somebody spends months trying to take it away. I went inside before dark and straightened a few framed photographs. I placed Anna's cedar keepsake box back on its shelf and left it there. Everything felt settled, or at least I thought it did. Around 9 that evening, my phone buzzed. The message came from an unknown number. No introduction, no explanation, just a GPS coordinate and one sentence. They weren't working alone. I stared at the screen for a long time. The coordinates pointed to another lakeside property nearly 4 miles away. The following morning, I checked public records and found something interesting. A recent survey filing connected to a name I had never seen before. Not Evelyn, not Connor, not anyone from the HOA. Somebody new. Somebody connected to a completely different development group. I opened the same notebook I'd started the day Evelyn first walked up my driveway. Most of the pages were already filled with names, dates, evidence, and memories. Then I turned to a fresh page and wrote down the new name at the top. Because by then I had learned something Evelyn Mercer never understood. Property lines aren't just marks on a map. They're records. They're history. They're proof. And eventually, if someone keeps crossing boundaries long enough, they stop trapping other people and start trapping themselves. So now I want to hear what you think. Was Evelyn simply a power-hungry HOA president who believed she was above everyone else? Or do you think a much larger land acquisition scheme was operating behind the scenes? And if someone walked onto your property and demanded you hand it over because they thought they deserved it more than you did, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments below, because something tells me this story is going to start a few debates.